Welcome, and thanks for listening to Cherry Bekert's Government and Public Sector podcast series. In each episode, we hear from the best in the business on the latest challenges, trends, and opportunities affecting the government and public sector. I'm Christian Fjellgraf, leader of Cherry Bekert's Government and Public Sector industry team. I hope you enjoy, and thank you for joining.
Welcome to another edition of the Cherry Bekaert podcast on the topic of trust in government. I'm Srikant Sastry, and I lead advisory services for Cherry Bekaert. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Ed DeSeve, Executive Fellow at the IBM Center for the Business of Government and coordinator of the Agile Government Center at the National Academy of Public Administration. Welcome back, Ed.
Thanks, Srikant. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm delighted to be co-chairing this with you for one more ride on the journey towards restoring trust in government. And we have a great discussion ahead of us today. On our first podcast on the topic of trust in government, we dove deeply into the topic of improving the citizen experience, because according to the OECD, it's one of the major drivers in trust in government. This time, we're talking about another of the OECD drivers, openness or government transparency. According to the OECD, governments with high levels of trust among their citizenry provide open and accessible information so the public better understands what government is doing. That's why it's so great that we're joined by one of the U.S. federal government's most ardent advocates of open government, Data Foundation President and CEO, Nick Hart. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for the invitation to join. Glad to be here.
So just got to ask you at the outset, LinkedIn is pretty open source there. People reveal quite a bit. Your header says using data and evidence to make the world better. Maybe explain a little bit what you mean by that.
Well, we've been talking about how to use data in our country and in society for generations. It's actually written into the Constitution that we collect data that is open and intended to be open for allocating representation. Our first statistical agency is the Census Bureau, and it's one of our great sources of open data, but they also have a lot of confidential records. And I love that you just used the term openness, which is a really important way of thinking about how we use data. So the work that we do at the Data Foundation, and actually the work that I've done for most of my career, is trying to think about how we apply openness, all of the forms of data, all of the forms of evidence to make better decisions. And that implicates Congress, the executive branch, program administrators, and even just regular people out there living their lives, trying to use information as well as they can. And there's so much that we've learned about improving data literacy, now AI literacy, artificial intelligence literacy, but all of that is foundational to having access to information. So how do we get that access, and how do we encourage that in our society? That's really what we're working on.
That's great, Nick. I would maybe ask you at the outset, this week can be a recurring theme for our discussion, but what's the state of openness in your view in the U.S. federal government?
Well, it's a complicated story. There are really pockets of incredible success in openness and open data. We have agencies that have been doing this for years. I mentioned the Census Bureau already as one of the great repositories of knowledge for the country. The federal statistical system produces economic indicators like gross domestic product, unemployment rates that drive markets. We also have places like the Environmental Protection Agency that produce information that's collected from regulated entities that they turn back around and make available to the American public. So you can see where the polluters down the street are emitting. All of that knowledge is useful for making just regular decisions. But the intent was always to have a lot more information to support the American public and decision makers. A couple of years ago, we passed a law called the Open Government Data Act, which said open should be the default in government. And we're still waiting to see full implementation of that. So there's still a long ways to go, but we've made an incredible amount of progress.
I'd be remiss in talking about openness in government if I didn't just ask Ed DeSeve to talk a little bit about his experience leading the recovery board, one of the great success stories in openness in federal government.
We had a very small band of brothers and sisters, and we had to involve the public in as transparent a way as possible in order to build trust that the $800 billion that we were spending was being spent wisely. We, along with a series of 12 inspectors general, developed a management system that included visualization of what was going on, where the money was being spent, who was spending it, and what was being produced. That could be accessed at any time by any individual throughout the world. We got great kudos for that, but it was hard. There were 77,000 funding recipients. And beyond that, there were a series of projects below that. So it's a lot of data in a lot of places. And unfortunately, the system has been taken down. It went to the Treasury after it went from the Recovery Act to the Treasury. But Nick, when we think about allowing people to use geospatial mapping in order to use data and do it easily, in other words, it didn't have to be somebody with a satellite connection or something like that. Is that helpful? Is geospatial mapping and other techniques like that helpful to making data available to people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's just an incredible amount of knowledge that people want about how their communities are operating. And if you think about, I used the example of the EPA and pollution. I mean, there's so much that's happening on the local level. A number of years ago, when the oil spill happened in the Gulf of Mexico, what was one of the big questions that we had? Well, of course, there were major environmental implications, but there were huge economic implications. And so we rapidly needed to generate knowledge at the county and at the city and even beneath that. FEMA is a good example of when there's an emergency. We need rapid insights about what's happening at a very micro level in order to be responsive to the American public and the needs that are in a time of disaster. So spatial information is just as important and very important at a community level.
Let me follow up on that with a question that I'm really having a struggle with now. It's interesting ex ante to figure out what's going on and how things are happening. We'd like to be able to reach out to the public as part of our Agile government movement and involve the public in discussions about policy before things happen. So getting their views, not just as customers, but also as people with inherent constitutional rights to vote. What do you think the best methods for involving the public and gathering comments on potential policies is, and who's doing it well now?
Well, and that's a really easy question that you've just posed to me. The real answer is like it depends, right? There's a lot of different data assets, a lot of different people will think about this in different ways. We use data in a lot of complex mechanisms, but there are really bright spots of how we think about this. Just over the last year, the Data Foundation produced something called a stakeholder toolkit that was exactly focused on this because we've recognized that when it comes to getting feedback on data and the conversations that we want with the American public, this is a big gap. And it's not to be critical of federal agencies, but it's a recognition that we can't just publish things in the Federal Register and expect to call that a conversation. That's one-way communication often where we're just hoping that the right people see it. But in reality, there's so much more that we have to envision for dialogue about data and the utility and ultimate use. Research practice partnerships are an emerging mechanism that we see in places like education and workforce, and that puts the user in the same conversation with the researcher about building the knowledge that they need. A couple years ago, when the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act was put into law, which people like Robert Shea, who was a commissioner on the Evidence Commission, know well, that law required engagement with the American public from agencies to ensure that they were asking the right questions on which we would be collecting and using data. And what we know from analyzing the plans that came out is that some agencies did a really good job and other agencies said our stakeholders are actually just the people inside the agency. That sounds a little bizarre. In reality, we're just getting started in understanding this. So there's a lot more to do in terms of reaching out. But you asked me for one good example, and I'm going to give you one. The Small Business Administration really excels at this. And when they put their learning agenda out a number of years ago, the intent was to find people who could help you answer those big, wicked questions. So SBA had really thoughtful dialogue, forums, and conversations to prioritize what the questions would be and what data to make available. When they published their learning agenda under the Evidence Act, people started calling them and saying, hey, if you can just give us access to your data, whether it's restricted or open, we can help you answer those questions. And then they did it. That's a really cool example.
Thank you. That's great.
So Nick, the work you're doing is really important, and I think your advocacy of this is quite fervent. But let me just ask you, does transparency really build trust in government, or can it also erode trust? There are examples of massive improper payments, the transparency of which, frankly, causes concern among citizens. How do where do you come down on is building trust versus eroding trust?
Well, it's certainly the case that the more knowledge we have about how programs are being implemented, and improper payments and even fraud is a good example of this. If fraud is occurring, that can erode trust. However, you can't address the fraud if you don't know it exists. So one of the reasons that we're talking about more openness of data and even program evaluations, program audits, performance audits, is that it helps us understand from an oversight and accountability perspective where we might need to have learning and improvement. And in reality, for exactly your point, we also need to be honest about where failures are occurring. That, if we can be honest about the failures and then addressing them with meaningful solutions, instead of just beating everyone over the head and trying to shut down the program, but say, okay, you made a mistake, now let's fix it. Let's use the data that we have. Let's use the insights that we've generated and make meaningful improvements. We know fraud in government programs is in the billions. That's not a secret, but we can use the tools that we have, including more openness of data, to come up with meaningful solutions that help us minimize both overpayments and underpayments to businesses and people. That's something that we know we can do.
Thanks. So Nick, I know the evidence agenda is of particular importance to you. How has the Evidence Act itself led to improvements in transparency about what's working in government?
Well, the Evidence Act is still very much being implemented today. We are at the 5-year anniversary mark, and the reality is the impacts have been phenomenal to date. But there is a long ways to go in seeing the real impact and intent of the Evidence Act. If it's fully implemented as we intended, then actually it should be increasing and improving trust in the American public have in government, and it should be a two-way street. You acknowledge the OECD's framework and on trust in government, and multiple pillars are actually implicated in the Evidence Act, not just customer experiences and good program design, but also data and evidence. And that's really the intent of the Evidence Act, is to help us implement our programs better, to learn and improve. And if we're doing that right, we should have more transparency and knowledge about how to improve our programs so that decision makers and the American public can use that information.
Nick, you gave us a great example on the SBA in terms of involving the public. Who's doing collection and dissemination of evidence best? Which federal agencies would you give a high grade to in that area?
Oh, now you've asked me to pick my favorite. There are a lot of agencies that are doing really good at it, and some of the agencies that I would say are doing the best have also been doing this for decades, and they had the framework already built into their underlying authorizations and authorities. So perhaps it's no surprise that places like the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, the Administration for Children and Families, has a lot of evaluation authorities and data sharing mechanisms, and even really strong privacy mechanisms already built into the frameworks that they're using. The Department of Education has a really strong framework for bringing together statistical data and new data governance concepts under a chief data office and evaluation all together. And then we're using all of that information to actually feed back into Congress and feed back into regulations to improve programs.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Nick, as we kind of start wrapping up here, just ask you your overall impression. How is the federal government doing, in your view, from the perspective of citizens? Are you finding that citizens are finding the government more open and transparent, or is it still a major work in process?
Oh, definitely a major work in progress. From the perspective of a normal person out there in the American public, government is wickedly complex. And we don't make it easy for government to communicate what it is doing well and where improvements have meaningfully been made. And when you have to cut through political discourse and the complexities of the never-ending appropriations processes and budget cycles, it is no wonder that someone who's just looking at government from afar and then also trying to understand multiple layers of government might be challenged in understanding the success stories. So this is actually a really important area for the entire community as we're talking about trust. We have to tell the stories better, the narrative about how we are actively improving and addressing some of the challenges using data, using evidence, and with thoughtful solutions that span the political spectrum that aren't necessarily controversial. That's really meaningful and powerful. And Ed, you acknowledged improper payments and fraud. The fact that it's not a controversial topic, that we're addressing fraud in government and that we're driving down improper payments and trying to, that should be a headline, regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum. People care about that, and it matters.
Indeed, it matters. It matters quite a bit. So, Nick, I'd like to thank you for your observations, your great work and advocacy for openness in federal government. Ed, as always, a pleasure to co-host this podcast with you. And thank you both for contributing to Cherry Bekaert's ongoing conversation about trust in government.
Thank you.
This was Christian again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and look forward to our next one. Don't forget to subscribe.